author of the book Young People on the Margins and a visiting fellow at the Sheffield Institute of Education. He's currently working on a new book about education policy. Thank you, Loic, for your time. Katherine Birbalsingh, who is the government's social mobility czar, warning today that social mobility is about more than rags to riches stories. It's more nuanced, and about the gains that can be made as people move around the social strata. They're not always as obvious and as stark as some of those stories suggest. What do you think she's driving at?
Yeah, I mean, as a country, we've long been obsessed with these sort of Dick Whittington style stories of kind of going from rags to riches, and you see that even in the press, which is often dominated by stories of self-made millionaires or about the poor kid who makes it to Oxbridge, and that's actually the story for a very small minority of people. It's less than 1% of kids go to Oxford or Cambridge each year, so it's a small story, and yet it dominates a lot of what we talk about. And when it comes down to it, a lot of people who have very reasonable and ordinary hopes and aspirations are finding, but come from poorer backgrounds, are finding that those hopes are pipe dreams for them. And so I think it's right that we should look beyond that very small percentage who reach the stratospheric heights and think about ordinary people's lives and the barriers that are stopping poorer people, particularly children from poor backgrounds, from being able to achieve those dreams.
Well, I suppose, yes, if the narrative is of rare and exceptional successes, then by definition they're not going to be very inspiring to very many people, because most people will think, well, that's great, but it is rare and exceptional, and it's not something that's likely to happen to me or be achievable by me.
Yeah, I mean, lots of studies have shown that most parents, when their children are born, do hope that their child will go on to university and will go on to great things, but I've certainly found it in my research with young people and their families in disadvantaged communities. What people talk about is a hope for a decent life, a life in which they know that they can count on having a family holiday, a decent house, and some stability. And what we're finding is that for a lot of people that's out of reach. And that's the really sharp end of social mobility right now, is that a lot of people are stuck, unable to reach those hopes.
Well, Katherine Birbalsingh is, we understand, going to say that there is no one-size-fits-all model of social mobility. How would you, Loic, define social mobility? It's one of those sort of wonkish terms that's been around with us for decades, but what would you understand it to mean? How would you define it?
Well, it's been it's measured in all sorts of ways, and one of the problems with trying to measure it is that you don't really know whether you've achieved it until it's a bit too late, right? So we don't know what a child born now is going to go on to achieve for a long time. So we don't know what the current state of social mobility is. But what we talk about when we're talking about social mobility is the chances of moving from, say, the poorest 10% to the richest 10%, of the richest 10% to the poorest 10%. So that mobility across, well, sometimes we talk about it in terms of income, sometimes we talk about it in terms of jobs, but we also need to remember wealth, because a lot of this is not about how much income you've got, it's about what wealth you have to start off with. So it's measured in all sorts of ways, and it's a really slippery term. But ultimately what it should mean, I think, is about to what extent people from different backgrounds are able to write their own life story and shape where they end up, rather than that being defined by where they've come from.
How much of this is about class? I have never known which class I am from or supposed to be from or supposed to be in. I've never really understood that. I don't know if that is unusual or otherwise, or whether that lack of understanding of how our class system is supposed to work is more common than we think. How much of social mobility is about class? And to go back to what John Major said when he was Prime Minister all those years ago, are we any closer to a classless society?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's deeply wrapped up with class, and that's why I think it dominates so much of the discussion in the UK, which has this sort of long history of investing itself in discussions about class. And when we measure it in a technical sense, we then tend to talk about income and wealth and so on. But we see that a lot of the difficulties we've got at the moment to do with status as well. So there is a currency of status, and what we're finding in a lot of left behind communities is that a lot of the anger and challenges that people are facing are to do with feeling like they're not being able to be part of that kind of status that is afforded to people in other jobs. in other parts of the country.
Do you think we'll ever stop talking about class? Because as you said that, I'm thinking of a couple of examples. You could, for example, let's look at income and how it relates to class. You could have somebody from a very poor background who becomes an influencer or goes on reality television and, you know, ends up earning hundreds of thousands of pounds per year. Now, those people who are obsessed with class would probably not contend that such an individual has moved into the upper classes simply because they're worth a very great deal of money. Similarly, you could have somebody who works in the city or someone who is from what is thought to be an upper middle class or upper class background who loses all of their money and ends up on the dole. And the people, again, who are obsessed with class probably wouldn't say that that individual has fallen down to the working classes or below if they consider there to be such a thing. So how do we disentangle class and income?
Yeah, and I think we will always talk about it. I think what we really should be talking about is the fact that we have 4 million children growing up in poverty, and that will hold them back in life because they find themselves trying so hard to keep up and to make it that they're kind of on this downhill escalator running to keep up. And so we need to really face those more brutal and fundamental questions which will make a difference to their lives, rather than necessarily those rags to riches stories, and those questions of class which we often think about to the exclusion of the questions around what's actually helping families to support their children to succeed in the future.
And when you talk there, Loic, about millions of children being in poverty or being in families that are living in poverty, that really does throw a lot of this into sharp focus, because if you are a child who's starting each day or going through each day with not enough food in your stomach, it's very difficult to imagine how you've got the mental and physical energy to progress in the way that you might want anyway. We're really in a very, very bad place as far as that is concerned, with the cost of living crisis and also the entrenched, it seems, inequalities with which we've been living for far too long.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even before the pandemic, when you looked at the toughest end of poverty, destitution. So we found that there were 500,000 young people there, children who were growing up destitute, and that meant that they were missing out on some of the essentials of food and shelter and so on. And that was before the pandemic, before the cost of living crisis. So these things are getting worse, whereas in the past they've got better. And we know that these experiences hold kids back. I was a teacher. I've been a youth worker. I've seen what it means when a child's trying to cope with what's going on at home because of that, and the struggles that their families are having, and how that makes it so hard for them to be able to concentrate in class and do well. So it's no wonder that they're struggling to achieve these sort of big lofty goals of social mobility that we might have as a society.
Loic, thank you. Loic Menzies, author of the book Young People on the Margins and a visiting fellow at the Sheffield Institute of Education. And he's currently working on a new book about education policy. Well, Katherine Birbalsingh